going to be by Guy Bresler from MIT. Take it away, Guy.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Thanks to all the organizers for the invitation. Really enjoyed the workshop so far. So the goal of this talk is to present a set of results based on average case reductions, which provide a complementary and powerful perspective towards understanding statistical computational gaps. And that's sort of as compared to studying restricted classes of algorithms, which has been what the majority of the talks have been about. So despite this being a different perspective, we'll see that reductions can also sort of raise the stakes for studying specific problems. And the specific problem here is going to be secret leakage planted clique. And it's going to raise the stakes for studying this problem under restricted classes of algorithms. So there's very much complementary perspectives that kind of can help one another. So this is joint work with Matt Brennan. He's a student at MIT. And this project would not have been remotely the same without him. And he's even in the audience already. So I guess one other note, the paper's on archive. Please go have a look at it if there's stuff in the talk that you want to learn more about. Okay, so I'm going to go through the intro. It's going to be kind of a basic intro. I'm going to go through it very quickly. The reason being that there are various notions that I sort of need to emphasize. And hopefully if I go through it at an appropriate pace, there will be time left over for more technical content in the second half. Okay, so the sorts of problems that we're interested in are estimating some signal and noise. All of the talks virtually have been either this or some optimization variant. And one thing that's worth mentioning is that these sorts of high dimensional stats problems typically have a bunch of parameters, dimension, for, some sort of structure parameter, for example, sparsity, number of samples, signal strength parameter, possibly others in addition to these. Now, the basic question you might ask, and that we've all been asking, is, well, how much data do you actually need? So if we're going to look at an example, we might look at the spiked covariance model and consider a tuple of parameters, and you'd want to know, well, can I solve this for a given tuple of parameters? So to answer this sorts of question, we're going to view as the solution a feasibility diagram. The diagram is a plot that for any point on this plane here, we have some sparsity that's given by alpha. In other words, k is n to the alpha. That's the sparsity of the signal. On the vertical axis, we have beta. As beta gets bigger, theta is n to the minus beta, and the signal gets weaker. And so any point here, if we fix d is equal to n, which I wrote up there, we have a given tuple of parameters. You might ask, is this feasible or not? The information theoretic question was answered by Berthet and Rigoulet. And they weren't entirely satisfied, as none of us are, because efficient algorithms can't actually achieve the information theoretic threshold as far as we know. So they sought to explain this, proved a lower bound based on planted clique hypothesis. Then a bunch of other people, both you'll see chronologically before and after, worked very hard, both on the algorithmic side and the lower bound side, to complete this feasibility diagram. So on one hand, this is great. We have a good understanding of what's happening with sparse PCA in terms of feasibility computationally and information theoretically. Just to be extra clear here, easy here means polynomial time, typically very fast. Hard means feasible in principle, but computationally hard. Impossible means straight up impossible. You can't do it, even with arbitrary runtimes. Okay, so yeah, so this is good on the one hand, but it's also troubling because it's a huge amount of work by a ton of people to understand this one problem, and we have a big variety of problems. Each of these problems has its own peculiar structures. Some of these are graph matching problems, graph clustering problems, tensor problems, cryo-EM, regression. Virtually every problem we care about has this sort of easy, hard, impossible phase diagram. And it would be really, really nice to have some sort of unified understanding of what's causing the hardness, where is this hardness, and so forth. So in particular, we might ask, well, what would it even mean to say that a set of problems each have their hard regime for the very same reason? Okay, and some of the motivation for this whole talk and this whole work is that an extremely satisfying answer would be that there's some source problem or root problem, for instance, planted clique, that reduces to all of these, in particular, reduces to all of these in each of their hard regimes. And that fully would then explain why each of those is hard in the hard regime, because there is, in some sense, an instance of planet clique living inside of it. And so that's the reductions approach that I'll explain in a little more detail, but that's sort of the high level, is that it really gives a sort of unified picture when one is able to produce such a reduction. Okay, so a few broad objectives just to emphasize, and this is what we're all trying to do in this workshop, is predict computational data limits for efficient algorithms and give evidence for where that limit is. We want to find optimal algorithms, and optimality is under some sort of strong evidence for the lower bound that one cannot improve upon what these algorithms are doing. We want to understand the basic phenomena. What's going on? Why is this problem hard? And if we might be very ambitious and dream a bit, then we might hope to understand relationships between these problems. And a sort of pipe dream would be to say that any problem under the sun that you would care about is in some sense the same problem. And this, you would look to complexity theory and look at big complexity classes like NP-complete problems as inspiration for that. So what are we going to do in this talk? Well, I'm going to spend a little bit of time motivating in a little bit of detail and explaining the average case reductions approach and what we get out of it. And then we're going to obtain a unified understanding for the computational phase diagrams for a variety of problems via a generalization of planet clique that's called secret leakage planet clique. There's an asterisk here, which is that this is quite a short talk, and there's only going to be time to present one of many reductions that are in the paper. I'll only present one in some detail. Okay. So average case reductions. The notion of average case reduction, the notion of reduction that's appropriate for us that we use is average case reduction in total variation. And so the idea here is that you start with some problem. Here is P, and we're going to consider hypothesis testing problems in this talk. And most of what I say will apply also to estimation problems. But for the details on that, you can look in the paper. But yeah, for the purpose of the talk, hypothesis testing problems. So we have a hypothesis testing problem. There's one distribution, that's the null distribution, P sub H0. There's another distribution, that's the alternative distribution, P sub H1. And you have also a problem of interest that's P prime. And what you want is a polynomial time algorithm, A, that takes as input an instance, and you don't know, or the algorithm doesn't know whether it's the null or the alternative, H0 or H1, and it produces the corresponding output. And that's what this arrow denotes, is that it maps to the corresponding output in distribution. And the error here, little o of 1, is an error in the total variation distance between the desired target and the actual output of the algorithm. So why is this good? Well, it's good because if somebody claims to have some algorithm A prime that solves the hypothesis testing problem P prime, well, then you would have a solution to the original problem. To see that, suppose that somebody flips a coin to then produce a sample either from H0 or H1. You don't need to know which one it is because the algorithm in either case maps to the correct output distribution. And then you have a genuine instance of the desired P prime problem. Algorithm A prime solves it because it is supposed to solve the P prime problem, and you've then solved the original problem. So a little bit more formally, the composition of the reduction and the algorithm A prime is actually an algorithm for the original problem. And you can convince yourself also that its runtime is basically that of A prime plus that of the reduction. All right, so reductions are quite effective in reasoning about computational complexity. That's why they're the bread and butter of complexity theory. And for our purposes, there are a few things that I want to emphasize. One is that if the reduction itself is very efficient, let's say linear time, then reductions transfer fine-grained runtimes, both above and below polynomial time. A second point is that if you want to understand the complexity of the target problem, it suffices to consider the root problem for the purpose of showing hardness. What do I mean by this? Well, if you have hardness based on some conjecture that some restricted class of algorithms is optimal, for instance, low degree likelihood ratio or statistical query algorithms or whatever, and under a belief that that class of algorithm is optimal, one concludes that the root problem is hard, that hardness is immediately transferred to the target problem. Okay, so that's nice. And if that root problem reduces to many target problems, then one really only needed to show hardness for the restricted class of algorithms for that one root problem. And this is all, of course, under the assumption that one cares about efficiency or lack of, or existence or lack of existence of an efficient algorithm for the target problem. There is sort of a nitpicky point here, which is important, which is that if, for instance, we take low degree polynomials as our class of algorithms, the reduction might not be a low degree polynomial itself. And so one doesn't necessarily immediately conclude that the target problem is hard for low degree polynomials. But if one takes low degree polynomials, their failure as evidence for there being no polytime algorithm, one transfers the existence of or non-existence of polytime algorithms. Okay, good. So in light of this, the reductions are future-proof against new and stronger class of algorithms, because if someone comes up with something better, then it suffices to consider the root problem and study that in depth for the new class of algorithms. So this is the motivation for reductions. And given all this, we're very motivated to try to find reductions. And we, in this paper that I'm discussing, we obtained the following web of reductions with secret leakage planet clique up here at the root, and then propagating out to all the problems that are here on the slide. Okay, so a few quick remarks about this web. The first is that the first layer here, I guess I have this laser pointer. So the first layer here, k-partite planet clique, bipartite planet clique, bipartite planet clique, and k-partite hypergraph planet clique. You could just assume something about each of these and use those as your hardness assumptions. It turns out that k-partite hypergraph planet clique is actually a stronger hardness, assuming that that problem is hard in a certain regime implies hardness for the rest of them. And so if you would like, you could assume that just this one problem is hard. Secret leakage planet clique is a unified way of viewing all of these problems and potentially many others. All right, so I'm gonna describe what is secret leakage planet clique, and then we'll go on to the reduction technique and an application of it. That's the one that we chose to highlight in this talk. Okay, so if I'm going to describe secret leakage planet clique, I'd better quickly describe planet clique, the original ordinary planet clique. So what is it? Well, one starts with an Erdős-Rényi random graph, let's say Gn half, and then uniformly at random plants a K clique, a fully connected subset of size K. Of course, one doesn't know the identity of the vertices and they're not colored red. And the task is to recover those vertices that are in the clique, or the hypothesis testing variant would be to decide, was a clique even planted in the first place? Okay, so in the hypothesis testing variant, we have H0 is pure noise, H1, there's a clique in there. So what's known? Well, if the size of the clique that you put in there is bigger than 2 log n, then it's going to be bigger than the size of the biggest naturally occurring clique in a random graph. And so one can detect presence of the clique just by searching over all subsets. Clearly, that's not efficient. If one is restricted to polynomial time, then all of the known algorithms require constant times root n. And for example, spectral algorithm succeeds in that regime. Despite decades of effort, this hasn't been improved upon, and so it's conjectured to be computationally hard if the size of the clique is smaller than the square root of n. Okay, and this is the planet clique conjecture, is that indeed it's hard. All right, so I'll mention here that there's been work by a large variety of folks, including people in this workshop, on understanding why is planet clique seemingly hard in this regime of k is smaller than root n. Okay, just one note. I'm often asked, what is this average case? Why do you talk about average case? Probably everybody here knows this, but just in case, average case just means that the input to the problem is drawn from a distribution. So when we talk about average case reductions, we talk about mapping distributions. All right, so most of the average case reductions start from planet clique and map to a problem of the following form: sparse submatrix plus independent noise. If you look at this, if you squint your eyes, then this doesn't look so different from the starting assumption of planet clique itself. And there are many problems with very different structures. And so one would hope to map also to those other problems. Yet there's never, there's little evidence that one can actually do this using reductions. So that was our primary motivation. We wanted to know, well, can you actually map to this huge variety of problems with different structures that are quite different from sparse submatrix plus noise using average case reductions? And our answer is yes, you can, but planted-clique does not seem like the right starting point. Instead, it turns out to be useful to consider slight variants or generalizations of planted-clique. So here's one example of such a variant of planted-clique. So instead of the clique being uniform at random over all n choose k subsets of size k, we're going to imagine that the vertices are in k different parts, and the clique is guaranteed to have one vertex from each part. So if you think about this for a bit, the entropy or the total number of possible cliques is essentially the same as it is in the ordinary planted clique. We haven't significantly constrained its position. It doesn't help that much to find it. And so we conjecture that this remains hard for cliques up to size root n. But at the same time, there is a little bit of information about the clique. You know, for instance, that if the partition of the vertices has 1 through n over k as the first partition, you know that you can't have 2 clique vertices in that first part. So there is a little bit of information. So that's one example of the sort of starting problem that we consider. There are several others, bipartite versions, k-part bipartite versions, k-partite hypergraph versions that I won't define carefully, but they're of similar flavor. And all of these can be captured in a single general setup, which we call secret leakage planted-clique. So what is this problem? Well, take rho to be a distribution on k subsets of the vertices, and let the G rho secret leakage distribution be obtained by starting with an Erdős-Rényi random graph with edge probability half, select a subset S according to distribution rho, and then plan to k-clique on that subset. So it's just like planted-clique, except for the distribution over the cliques is rho instead of uniform. Now the task is to detect presence of the clique. And so it's a hypothesis testing problem. You could, of course, ask also the estimation problem. It's not hard to check that each of the example problems that I defined a moment ago are actually instances of secret leakage planted-clique with appropriately chosen rho, with appropriately chosen distribution over the cliques. All right, so when is this generalized planted-clique or secret leakage planted-clique problem hard? The PC rho conjecture is that if you consider 2 independent samples, S and S prime, from rho, so you are taking 2 independent cliques, and one considers the probability mass function of the overlap of the intersection of these 2 sets, then if that decays at some rate, then the problem is computationally hard. Then there is no polynomial time algorithm solving the problem. So where'd this come from? Well, this comes from the low degree likelihood ratio calculation for this problem. And it's also supported by the statistical query framework. And we very much invite any of you who have your favorite class of algorithms to study this problem. And hopefully we can gain insight into it. All right, so that's secret leakage planted-clique. In the remaining time, I'm going to talk about an example reduction technique that we call Bernoulli rotations, and I'll show how it's applied to reduce to a single problem, and I'll jump right in. There's not a whole lot of time left. Okay, so Bernoulli rotations. So before I talk about Bernoulli rotations, it turns out actually that we need to talk about changes of measure. You might want to change the measure of the distribution of entries in a matrix, for example, if you want to map from planted-clique to biclustering. This is the problem that Subabrata talked about earlier this morning. So here we have Bernoullis getting mapped to Gaussians. Now, the simplest way to map this entire matrix is to map each entry individually. And this sort of map was what Ma and Wu did in their paper on biclustering in 2014, and was also developed in a paper of Hayek, Wu, and Xu. and then further generalized into a form that we called reduction kernels in a couple of papers over the last few years. Okay, so what is it that we want? We want a random mapping, RK, rejection kernel, that takes as input a random variable. And concretely, it's going to be either 0 or 1, but it's coming from some distribution. So that if it had input that was distributed Bernoulli half, then the output is very close in total variation to standard Gaussian. And if the input's 1, then it's very close in distribution, in total variation to Gaussian with mean mu and variance 1. So how would you construct such a mapping? Well, it turns out it's actually not that hard. So the first case is immediate. If the input is 1, well, then you have to just produce an output sample that's Gaussian with mean mu. What do you do if the input is 0? Well, we know what we want the output to be if the input is Bernoulli half. So you can solve a system of linear equations and conclude that if the input is 0, you would like to produce a sample that has density 2 phi 0 minus phi 1, where phi 0 and phi 1 are the appropriate Gaussians. And then you can check that the Bernoulli half gives rise to the half-half mixture of the 1 and the 0 case. And indeed, that's phi 0. That's the distribution we wanted. So there's a problem here. If you think about it for a bit, you see that 2 phi 0 minus phi 1 is not necessarily a valid density because it takes negative values. So this is an annoyance. And this annoyance is overcome by truncating the density to the positive part. It amounts to conditioning in a certain range. And that induces a small error in total variation distance. And so that's why this mapping is approximate. Okay, so what have we accomplished? Well, we've taken as input a Bernoulli that's either Bernoulli half or Bernoulli 1, and we've produced as output Gaussian that's either mean 0 or mean mu. So that was a change of measure. It's largely, you could argue, an aesthetic consideration, but it turns out that this change of measure is also useful for changing the structure of the planted signal. And that's where Bernoulli rotations come into the picture. So what is the goal of Bernoulli rotations? The setup is as follows. You have a vector of IID Bernoulli half random variables, but there is a single position I that's been fixed to 1. Okay, so you could think of this as some sort of planted vector. Now what we want to output is a Gaussian vector with independent entries and the mean vector a sub I. So I corresponds to the bit that was fixed to 1. And we have n such possible mean vectors corresponding to each possible location of the fixed bit. Formally, the planted Bernoulli distribution gets mapped to the appropriate Gaussian. This tau attenuation is essentially a log factor, polylog factor, and there's also this extra factor here that's the largest singular value of the matrix formed by these A vectors. And so if you don't want to have this mean being very close to 0, then one should not have too big of a singular value. So how does one obtain this sort of mapping? I'll describe that in a second. Worth mentioning that the whole magic in applications here is going to be choosing the AIs in a smart way, and the AIs are often going to be a flattening of some matrix or tensor. All right, so here's the Bernoulli rotation algorithm. We start as input this planted Bernoulli vector, Bernoulli halves with unknown planted ith bit equal to 1. We form B prime, which is a Gaussian version, by applying the Gaussian rejection kernels. We then sample a vector u that's isotropic Gaussian in n dimensions. And then we form this vector x that's given by this superposition of these two quantities. And let's parse this and see what those quantities each actually are. So first, let's go back to V prime. Well, V prime is a Gaussian with isotropic covariance and mean vector that's the standard basis in the ith coordinate, of course, rescaled a bit. And so then if you hit this vector by matrix A, then that picks out the appropriate column. So this first term is the correct mean that we're hoping for. Of course, now we've screwed up the covariance of this matrix. A V prime has not the correct isotropic covariance. So the second term here corrects the covariance and it cancels the induced correlations that the first part caused. And so this indeed does what we want it to. All right, so just really quickly, I'm going to show how this Bernoulli rotations sort of gadget is actually used for a genuine problem of interest in the statistics community to change the structure meaningfully and map precisely in total variation to robust sparse mean estimation. I might go a couple minutes over. Sorry about that. Okay, so what's the problem that we're interested in? Well, I'll talk about sparse mean estimation first. It's the problem of the hypothesis testing variant would be deciding between isotropic Gaussian and the same thing, but with a small mean shift, where now tau is some k-sparse unit vector, and then its L2 norm is this epsilon factor in front. So that's sparse mean estimation. There's no information computation gap. A second problem is robust sparse mean estimation. And here, this is under Huber's contamination model of robustness. So now there is epsilon 1 minus epsilon mixture, and you could think of it as an epsilon fraction of the samples are contaminated by some outlier distribution, D outlier. And now there is conjectured to be a statistical computational gap. This has been made rigorous in the statistical query framework by Diakonikolas, Kane, and Stewart. And the gap is a k versus k squared gap. Okay, so this is the problem that we want to reduce to. And we're going to consider a special case here, which is just choosing a particular outlier distribution. And the cartoon of how the data matrix looks like is a D by N matrix with a block here that's this blue and red. And the blue corresponds to the correct mean, and the red corresponds to these outlier means. So here's how the reduction looks. It's actually very simple now that we have everything set up. We start with an instance of k-part bipartite PC, and so there are ones in each appropriately sized block here. We apply Bernoulli rotations to each of these vectors individually. We get a Gaussian with appropriate mean, where this mean is a column in some matrix, or here, let's say a row in some matrix. One does this to all of these subvectors within the starting matrix that was this bipartite Planck-Leak adjacency matrix. And one gets the following, which is a Gaussian matrix now with all of these shifted means. We compare this to our cartoon, and we can see that we would like one of these AJ vectors to just have two values, either blue or red. And so that gives us our design criterion. Tells us sort of what we want out of these vectors. And it turns out that one can indeed construct the AI vectors. This construction that's described here comes from the incidence geometry of points and hyperplanes in vector spaces over finite fields, FR to the T. And it turns out to exactly satisfy the criterion, so that this cartoon that we had of robust sparse mean estimation is actually what one maps to. Okay, so this is just one reduction to one problem that I described. There are a bunch of other reductions to a bunch of other problems. In the negative several minutes, I'll just say in 10 seconds that here's sort of a schematic of the reduction to mixtures of sparse linear regressions, which is much more complicated and combines a number of such reduction gadgets to then reduce to mixtures of sparse linear regressions from k-part bipartite Planck-Leak. And so one of the exciting things I think with this approach is that each of the reduction gadgets can be applied hopefully to many other problems in the future in new and interesting ways. Awesome. So to conclude, there's a new unifying problem that I think deserves more study: secret leakage Planck-Leak. We reduced to a number of different problems with very different structures, and there's a great deal left to do. And we're very excited about this direction. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Guy. We do have time for questions.
Maybe I can ask something.
Go ahead.
So like, how complicated are finally the secret leakage that we're using? Like, you use the k-partite, like you use the hypergraph, like, I don't know, like how complicated does it get? Like, since you have all these Like
Well,
general.
yeah, exactly. That's a great question. I mean, we just use these 4 in the paper. So in the, I mean, I guess the whole web is here. So we only use the 4 that are appearing here. And actually the k-partite hypergraph PC is stronger than any of the others. So you could just use that one for the purpose of the reductions that we carry out. The unification, I think, is meaningful. And yeah, we sort of just viewed it as a way to kind of coherently address all of them and produce a single
I think it's very
conjecture.
cool.
Thanks, yeah.
Yeah, thank
Guy, you made the point about runtimes transferring in a fine-grained way. One thing about planet clique reductions is that, at least in the vanilla planet clique, they don't typically give you lower bounds of the kind that, like Ilias was talking about just before, these, a sub-exponential type of lower bounds. Can you hope to get that from these stronger planet clique variants?
Great question. Yeah, so I think it depends. I think that probably the right answer would be that one wouldn't want to consider these particular variants of planet clique. One would want to consider constrained variants of planet dense subgraph. So planet dense subgraph has very similar behavior in terms of sub-exponential time algorithms and so forth, as you know, I guess. And so all of these reductions actually work starting from those problems.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Do you think there's hope to get a reduction to KSAT, like maybe refutation just above the satisfiability threshold?
Oof, this sounds very hard, but I personally haven't particularly thought about it. It's hard to know. I mean, I think that it's hard to know ahead of time whether there's going to be a reduction to any particular given problem. I mean, I should say that a priori, I didn't think that we could reduce to any of these problems, and Matt proved me wrong. So yeah, so I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but like somehow, I mean, it does require, I think, sort of a lot of thought to even get a sense for, can one reduce to a given problem when the structures are so different.
I saw TensorPC on the slide, so I was hopeful maybe that you had thought about it, but.
Oh,
Yeah, so, like,
yeah, sorry. So to be fair, we thought about it. Maybe Matt can answer, but we did think about it. There are some peculiarities here that we don't know how to overcome that are specifically with the sparsity there.
Yeah, so like, for example, like,
say.
yeah, like if you replace TensorPCA with 3 XOR, you'd imagine, like, algorithmically it's kind of the same, but for reductions, it seems like it's a little nastier, because the fact that you have like sparse noise rather than like dense noise as you have in TensorPCA seems to make a difference for reductions. So at the moment, yeah, like a lot of techniques break going to something like these random CSPs. But like a priori, we don't have any like real technical like obstruction that we're able to prove against these sort of reductions. So we don't know at the moment.
Yeah, maybe just to add, reductions to sparse things are something that we don't understand very well. There are also some reductions here in the upper left to variants of stochastic block models, but all of those are in dense settings.
We have a question from Ashwin. Ashwin, can you speak up right now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thanks, guys. Just a quick question. Maybe you already addressed this in some form or another, but is there some sense in which there are reductions within secret leakage? Like there are some priors that imply hardness for other priors? Or, you know, is this entire ensemble of assumptions that you stated somehow incomparable?
No, I mean, it's a perfect question. Yeah, so the k-partite hypergraph planet clique would be one particular variant that's a stronger assumption than the other 3 that are there, and there is a reduction from k-partite hypergraph planet clique to the other 3. So for our purposes,
but is there a more general like version of this?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think it would just depend in the in the context whether something would whether it would make sense to assume a more general version. We haven't needed to yet, so I don't know if we've been motivated to think in that direction. But it's a good question. Yeah, what's the sort of strongest concrete single assumption? As far as I know, this is the one so far. Is this hypergraph variant?
Yeah, one comment on that, like, yeah, Guy's totally right. Like, I don't know if there's any sort of general principle that we're aware of. in fact, like at the moment, within reductions, like within secret leakage, like the ones from k-partite hypergraph planning clique to these other three are all kind of trivial. So we don't really have any examples of non-trivial reductions within secret leakage. One kind of technical obstruction to this is it's even not known how to reduce from an instance of planning clique with like planet clique size k and graph size n. And edge density edge density like a quarter, for example, to the corresponding version with the edge density half. So like to some extent, reducing within secret leakage would have to capture some of these things, because if, for example, one example of secret leakage would be you just pair up all the vertices. And at that point, you can just take the and of all the edges within every bipartite graph of size 2 by 2. And then that will reduce the edge density from half to like 1 over 2 to the 6 or something. And so in that case, like it would have to be capturing these reductions that we don't know of. So like, I guess the short answer is that there aren't really any known non-trivial reductions within secret leakage yet.
Thanks.
Guy, maybe I can ask a slightly naive question. So
please, that's great. Yeah.
So I was intrigued because you mentioned this sort of robust sparse mean estimation question, right? And the version without this Huber contamination part doesn't have any information computation gap, right? But on the other hand, I see in your reductions, you have tons of problems where you don't need this robustness kind of thing, right? So is there any sort of intrinsic reason why in this particular problem, or you need this sort of Huber contamination part, whereas in others you don't need it? I guess, I don't know.
I think one can get some intuition about your question from thinking about how could you reduce to a non-robust version? And it turns out that those negative entries are necessary in the matrix, so that the matrix has sort of the desired properties. Otherwise, you sort of get a vacuous reduction kind of necessarily from that particular gadget. So I think one can look at it and see how it fails. But
yeah. So actually, so I was wondering whether there's any reduction-based hardness evidence for, say, block model under the KS threshold.
Yeah, so this there is, so the imbalanced 2 SBM here, that's kind of in the upper left of this web, you could think of as the task of recovering a first community out of K, where the rest are under a sort of mean field model that they're averaged over. Mm-hmm. And this is in the dense regime, then the KS threshold is supported by a reduction from k-partite planning clique.
Cool. Okay, but I guess as far as
yeah, is K larger than constant there? So is that first community kind of, is it little O of n the same way that planted cliques are?
Yes, yeah, it's K is scaling, yeah.
And then Siddhant's question was, what if you want to do something for sparse graphs? You said this is in the dense regime.
Right, so that is a great question, and I think if one figured out how to do that, it would be great. We don't know how, but it certainly is. I mean, connects also to what Matt was saying before, and the question that Sil had with 3XOR. I mean, I think we're just at the moment limited to dense things, and that's maybe one conceptual way to see that is that this Bernoulli rotations goes through Gaussians, and maybe there's some way to avoid that and to get to sparse things, but we've thought about it and we don't know how to do it at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sweet.
Just a further comment on Chris's question. So like the regime of K and this dense stochastic block model result is it's not like exactly the same as planning clique. Like K is allowed to be much larger than root n. Like K can be like n to the 1 minus epsilon for arbitrarily small epsilon. Just the only issue is that our lower bounds are coarse grained up to like factors of root log n in like all thresholds and signal parameters. So if you went to a regime where K were scaling linearly with n, then like our reduction would be too coarse grained to capture like, for example, like constant gap statistical computational trade-offs.
Okay,
But
let's. Sorry.
But at the moment, it seems hard. And I mean, I've asked Guy about this before, and I think this is great work. So I'm not trying to be negative, but it seems hard to see how one could fit like the K equals 5, the 5 community block model into this framework where, each community is size n/5.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally,
that's absolutely a great point. And I think it's perhaps the primary weakness of the reductions approach in general is because one has to inject a little bit of noise in carrying out these reductions. Inevitably, one loses small factors, and it seems hopeless to obtain that sort of precise of a result.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We should probably move on to the next talk. So maybe we can hold the rest of our questions for chat, or you can talk to Guy afterwards. So let's thank him again. And